Podcast is for 140. We're on Chapter 7 now on telecommunications rooms and their terminations. Our focus of this one is going to be looking at the different types of terminations we have in the closet, leading up eventually to the patch panel, which will be the main focus of Chapter 8. But let's dig in. First thing we need to remember is our telecommunications room. What is that? What's all included there? This is the point of termination where horizontal cabling runs coming from our work areas, from the computers, are need to get terminated or consolidated. So the telecommunications room is where all these horizontal cable runs come to, so we can consolidate them, terminate them, and connect to things like switches and routers and that sort of thing. This is also the interconnection point for backbone wiring. As we start connecting our data closets together, probably a fiber line going from switch to switch to switch, the telecommunications room is where this is coming to. So in my telecommunications room, our equipment closet, we're going to have all of our punchdown blocks, our patch panels, all of our terminations, our routing equipment, our switching equipment, our patch cables, possibly even servers, those sorts of things, possibly even phone equipment, phone servers, that kind of thing in there. So just kind of refreshing our memory, if we start out the work area, computer, patch cable to the wall, outlet on the wall, which we talked about in Chapter 6, horizontal cabling, up the wall, above the ceiling, down into a closet, down the hall, if you will. This is what we're talking about now, the telecommunications room. And we're looking at the equipment rack in here, patch panels, switches, patch cables in here. This is the kind of thing we're talking about now, the telecommunications room. So if I start looking at a building, this part of my building, these closets, these telecommunications rooms that are housing routers, switches, racks, equipment, those kinds of things. Here's even showing us the backbone cabling connecting our closets together. Probably a fiber line going from this switch up to the next floor, to the next switch, and so forth. If you think before, the drawing I showed you before, connecting my closets together, this is almost a kind of a redo of this picture here, showing equipment rack connecting fiber line down to equipment rack. These are the two telecommunications rooms in my building, probably one per floor. That's very common. So we're talking about this part of our building. And if I were to start looking inside, I'm looking at stuff like this, where I have equipment racks. In here I have patch panels, I have switches, I possibly have routers and servers in here. The cabling leaving there into trays, going up above the ceiling and down the hall to rooms, and possibly even down through the floor to the closet below. We're talking about this part of our building, this telecommunication room part of our building. Alright, they introduce us to a couple things, saying the wire that comes in, this horizontal cabling comes in, is punched down with an impact tool, with a punch down tool, into an appropriate block for termination. So, we're looking at punch down tool. Here's our punch down tool that would be used to force the wire, punch the wire into these different termination blocks. And in here I show you this style comes with a removable blade that I can flip around. One end of the blade has a 110 block jawl, if you will. The other end of the tool has a 66 block blade on. So this is actually designed to punch into the two major types of blocks that you would encounter in a telecommunications room. Alright, so let's start digging in now. Punch down blocks. This is the fundamental component for terminating the telecommunications wiring, the horizontal cabling coming from our work areas. And we have punch down blocks, and we also have patch panels. Well, patch panels, patch panels will be the main focus of Chapter 8. So we're not going to talk about a whole lot in Chapter 7, but we'll kind of get going in that direction. So our punch down blocks, the two main types we have are the 66 and the 110. Both are from AT&T, both from supporting phone systems and eventually adapting to data. A number of different companies make these now, but these were kind of originally developed by AT&T. As I look at them, here is some examples of 66 blocks. Here's the actual 66 block itself, snapped into a frame. Actually, here's a picture of the mounting frame. There's the block, snapped together, anchored to a wall, if you will. There's your 66 block. There's it all put together, anchored to the wall, and here's actually somebody punching in the wires into the block. Here's showing what the wires look like when they're terminated into the 66 block. Here's the other style 110 block, which we have actually talked about a little bit in, I think it was Chapter 4, 110 block. AT&T Systemax system, premise distribution system. Here is the 110 block. There's the mounting, the block on the wall, and there's the 110 connecting block that punches on top of it. There's a whole wall of 110 blocks. And here's another close-up of the 110 wiring block and then the 110 connecting block. Alright, so let's talk a few minutes about the 110 connecting block. It's been around for a number of years. Again, it had its roots in terminating phone wiring, but has been adapted for data wiring. The two main pieces on this guy, as we said before, is the wiring block that mounts to the wall and the 110 connecting block that terminates on top of it. So here's the wiring block that mounts to the wall, and then here's the connecting block that punch in on top of that. Again, another close-up or another picture of the 110 block on the wall, and then the connecting block that punches in on top. Here, actually, some of these pictures we showed you before is the 110 block, and then they're showing you a connecting block on top of that, terminating the horizontal cabling, if you will, and then a patch cable being punched in on top. And then reminding of this style of patch cable that we talked about before can actually be snapped in on top of here too. It's great for organizing and labeling cabling, designed for 22, 26 wire, solid wire only, again horizontal cabling or solid wire that you'd be using for phone. And a lot of times this actually gets terminated using the 788 type impact tool, this one here. And as you see, this style is actually designed to terminate all wires at one time. So as I start looking through this, I mount the 110 block on the wall, and then your connecting blocks punch in on top, but this is what it looks like when it's completed. Here would be my data wiring coming in or my phone wire coming in, going to be terminated, and then these here I have now connections for plugging a patch cable on to connect this into switches or phone server ports, if you will. Here's the process. I'm going to bring my horizontal cabling in here, lay it into the block. Once I do that, I punch it in with my punchdown tool. As I do, it cuts off the excess wires, or I use that 788 impact tool and do it all at one time. That's all punched in. Now I take my 110 connecting block here, put it into my impact tool, and punch that in on top. And again, what that's doing is cutting the insulation on these wires and making contact. So it's now, the horizontal cabling is now terminated, if you will. Now I label it, and I now have a connection point to plug onto. Here again, it's all finished, labeled. I now have a connection point to punch in a patch cable to go to my switch, or and actually here it is, here showing that punching the patch cable and using my impact tool, my punchdown tool, or I use a special patch cable to plug in on top, and now I can connect this down to, again, a switch, a data switch, or a phone switch port, if you will. Again, that's what it was really originally designed to do. So this would terminate my data wires, or I should say start off terminating my phone wiring, but also can be adapted for my data wiring. And here's another closet with a whole bunch of 110 blocks on the wall, terminating my phone wiring. This was suitable for category 5E and lower. As we move into the higher categories now, they just don't have the untwist and termination characteristics necessary for the higher bandwidth, higher frequencies. So really kind of in the 5E and lower. But for data and for phone and for lower data speeds, quite good termination, quite good organization for all that. Was able to do all that, but for modern network speeds, as we're getting into the gig and 10 gig, if you will, just not keeping up. The other punchdown block, the 66 one, this is really designed for phone, and I kind of always put it in the field of this is for phone termination, but we'll talk about it for a few minutes anyway. This has been around for a very long time, and the way this is set up, it is a 50 rows of pins for terminating basically 25 phone lines, because each phone line needs 2 wires, a tip and a ring. So this would be able to handle a 25 pair cable or 25 phone lines. That's the way this was set up to do. And here's zooming in, showing the cabling coming in and punching in. This is showing zooming in again, phone cabling. There's your tip and your ring kind of thing being terminated, and then over here is the other connection that all we would need to do is put a jumper in there to connect the two. 50 rows of bifurcated pins. That's the type of pin this is. That little slight V in there for punching the wires in. There's a whole wall of 66 blocks for, again, terminating phone wire in a facility, phone wiring. There is two types of 66 blocks, the 66M, if you will, and the connectorized 66 block. Well, the traditional 66 is the kind of ones I was showing you. You literally need to punch wires into both sides of the block. One side is typically for connection to your PBX, your phone switch, your phone server. And the other side of the block is typically for connections out to the phones. And we're talking, analog phone, if you will. Phones that would be sitting on people's desktops, that kind of thing. The other one, the connectorized, half the block is pre-wired for connecting directly into the PBX. The other half you would actually punch the wires into for the phones. So let's take a look. And actually, these were designed for terminating solid copper wire. As I punch the wire in, the V is cutting the insulation on there and making contact with the wire inside. So solid conductor wire, solid copper wire, 20 to 26 gauge, if you will. That was the design from behind it. Here's a close-up of an ordinary 66 block, and I'm just reminding you, one side is typically for wires coming from our PBX, our phone switch, our phone server. I punch these in, and then on the other side I punch wires in that are going out to phones in the building, and then I can put a little jumper in here to connect them. Well, it seems kind of odd, but super quickly, as I punch all the wires in here from the phone switch, these would be wires to say this is extension 1001, 1002, 1003, 1004. So that's kind of all hardwired in. Over here is wires going to phones. So as I need to move people around or people move around the building, I can unplug wires here, move them down and punch them in here to give them a new phone number. That kind of thing. Or as people change offices, I can move wires around. This gave me that connection point that I'm just moving wires on this half, not on this half over here. That's the idea behind it. Meanwhile, they also have a connectorized 66 block. Half of the block is pre-wired, and it's connected into this amphenol connector. This amphenol connector, then I can connect this whole block with one cable, this style of cable here, right into the PBX. So it ends up looking like this. The connectorized 66 block is pre-wired. I use one cable, and this plugs right into the PBX. And they even have extensions for these, the whole 9 yards. So I can very quickly wire this up, and then this side over here is where I punch my wires in to go to my phones out in the building. To terminate, again, I'm doing the same thing as mentioned before. I'm laying the wires in, I'm punching them in with my punchdown tool. It's really almost that simple. I lay the wires in here into the pin. I use my punch down tool, punch down on top. I'm using the 66 blade right here. As I punch down on top, the tool is spring loaded, and it kind of jams the wire down in the process of doing so, the V cuts the insulation on the wire and makes contact with the copper conductor inside. That's relatively easy to do that. For mounting these can be directly mounted to plywood that will be on the wall. We'll talk about standards in closets later, standards for closets later, but standards for closets say that you should have plywood on X amount of square footage on the wall, and that's for mounting things like 66 blocks directly to. And I screw these frames to the wall, and these frames give me a point to snap my 66 block into. They're snapped right into. There's a 66 block snapping into the frame, and this frame would be screwed to the wall. And there's roughly what it looks like when it's all done. My 66 blocks anchored to the wall, connections into phone switch and those sorts of things. All right, we're going to pause there. When we come back, we'll start talking about some other types of termination blocks that you might encounter.